welcome to App Stories, Federico. It's good to have you back. Where you been?
Well, I haven't gone anywhere.
I know.
Why are you? Why are you treating me like I disappeared or something?
No,
I've always been here.
You've always been here. Well,
I'm not going anywhere.
Good. We're all kind of stuck at home still, so I guess that makes sense. But yeah, we've got another big episode. We're going to talk today about what the iPad can learn from the Mac. This episode, by the way, is brought to you by DevonThink, which got a big update very recently, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the show. But first of all, Federico, what's new with you? What you been up to?
Not much in terms of writing itself, because I'm doing a lot of writing, but it's different kind of writing. It's sort of documentation and note-taking and research.
Right.
But I have been growing dissatisfied with my home screen. So that's probably what I'll be spending time this weekend, in addition to the video game that I picked on Mac Stories Unwind, which is Luigi's Mansion 3. I think as we record this, I think over the weekend, I am going to be tweaking my home screen again, because I'm really not feeling... I have two problems. On one hand, I want to use widgets more. And I feel like there's some widgets that I'm really using. The timery widgets I'm using a lot. The shortcuts widget, for example, I'm using a lot for my Apple Frames shortcut to Google Spotify lyrics, but I feel like I could optimize that. But there's also, on the other hand, the fact that some widgets I thought I will use a lot, but I actually am not. And I feel like some apps I would rather have the icon on my home screen. And so I'm trying to find this balance, and I don't know. I want to change a few things around. Like, for example, lately I've been using Spotify stations a lot, which is the Mac Stories favorite from last week's newsletter. I've been using it a lot in addition to the main Spotify app. And so I started wondering, maybe this should be right next to the Spotify icon on my home screen. Because right now I have this sort of hybrid approach where on my first page I have a stack of widgets, and then I have folders for media and other work-related apps, and then I have icons and another small widget. And I don't know, I'm really not feeling this layout. And I feel like I gotta find a better balance between icons, which I still open apps the old-fashioned way a lot.
Right.
And I noticed about myself that I've been using Spotlight, I've been using Search a lot lately, which I get it, because it got so much faster and quicker and more reliable in iOS 14. So it's only natural that I'm searching for apps and launching them via Search more, because Search is better this year. So that makes sense. But on the other hand, I also wonder, wouldn't it be better if the icon was always right there? So I'm not saying that I want to go back to a standard old school home screen without widgets, because I want to use widgets more. I just need to spend like an afternoon, sit down with my phone, look at my home screen, open the widget gallery on my iPhone, see all the widgets that I have installed. And I'll tell you what, something that I also noticed is that when you go to the widget gallery, I wish there was a way to actually demo widgets right there.
Yeah,
and to actually play around and tweak them in the gallery, because right now it's kind of clunky. Like, you have a lot of widgets and you have a lot of layout options and you have a lot of configuration options. But if you want to play around with those, you got to add the widget to your home screen. And you got to do it one by one. And it gets super clunky, especially if you, like me, have a lot of apps installed. So that's what I want to do. I want to just take an afternoon for myself, me, my phone, and I, just spending like 3-4 hours trying to understand, what do I want from the home screen pages of my phone. And additionally, I also need to finally set aside some quality time for the text editor that we mentioned a bunch of times before, Taio, Taio, which is an all-in-one sort of a clipboard manager, text editor, and automation utility. That's another case of I just need to find an afternoon, spend some time with it, 5-6 hours, trying to understand, do I still want to, rely on iWriter, or is Taio now mature enough? Because the developers are really iterating on the app quickly. is it mature enough that it could sustain the kind of workflow that I want to have?
Mm-hmm.
But mostly, I'm really interested in the automations that I can build in Tayo as sort of like a modern and spiritual successor to editorial. So yeah, this is what's on my mind right now. I just need to take some time for my home screen and for my text editor.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I use search an awful lot with my iPhone. It's probably, I use it far more than the app library, for instance. I think one of the things that I don't like about the app library is I feel like apps sometimes kind of get lost in there. Like I have to go searching, especially when it's like I find something on the App Store and I decide to download it and try it out for something we might write. And then I just kind of lose track of it because it's somewhere in one of those folders and I don't know what's going on. So that's a little bit of a problem. What you should do is you should like carve out or set aside some time each week to do these kind of experiments. That's kind of what I've been doing on Saturday mornings. I do my app research on Saturday mornings. I sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and just go through everything I've collected for the last week or so. And it really it's worked really well. It kind of sets my schedule for the next week in terms of what I might write about and put in the club and all that kind of things. It's worked out pretty well if you have that kind of time. And I've just tried to kind of make it. I've been experimenting with home automations and personal automations and shortcuts lately and trying to find ways around some of the limitations because there's an awful lot of limitations in there. And, there's no perfect way around them. But, this kind of started when I put together for the club a personal automation for doing do not disturb on both my iPhone and my Mac at the same time. And I used remote control for the Mac, which is an iOS app, as kind of a bridge between those two systems and as a way to expand what is possible from just, the personal automations, which can be triggered by do not disturb. And so I've been trying to do that both with personal automations and home automations and coming up with some ideas for things I might actually have in Club Mac Stories sometime relatively soon. Because the other thing that I think is a good way to extend them is to use the triggers like text messages or emails, because if you have some kind of service that either texts you or emails you with a certain kind of alert, those alerts can become triggers for automations. Now, you usually have to, in that situation, you have to confirm to run the shortcut, but it can be kind of a nice way to automate what your reaction to those sorts of emails is going to be. So that's what I've been working on. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by DevonThink. Have you ever found yourself wondering, where did I put my evil genius master plan? Well, that's a question that would never come up if you use DevonThink or DevonThink to Go. They're comprehensive document and information management solutions for the Mac and iOS. One place for storing all of your documents, snippets, or bookmarks, and then working with them. Integrated AI on the Mac assists you with filing and searching. There's also an extensive search language with advanced Boolean operators, too. Smart rules and flexible reminders let you automate all parts of your workflow and delegate the boring, repetitive tasks to automations that you create yourself. Let DevonThink automatically organize your data with rules you define. For example, you can imprint PDFs without touching them yourself. The app features flexible sync, supporting many cloud services or synchronizing locally on your own network. On top of that, everything is securely encrypted. And of course, there's much more, from email archiving and scanning to an embedded web server for sharing data securely with your team. A brand new version of the iOS Companion app is out now and available with a modern UI, OCR, shortcut support, and a whole lot more. So definitely check that out. Listeners of this show can get 10% off on DevonThink 3 or upgrades by going to devontechnologies.com/appstories, where you'll find a landing page where you can learn more about the app and take advantage of that discount. Again, the URL to get 10% off DevonThink 3 is devontechnologies.com/appstories. I'll put a link in the show notes too. Our thanks to DevonThink for their support of the show. All right, Federico, let's, dive into our topic today and talk a little bit about what the iPad can learn from the Mac. And last week we talked about what the Mac can teach the iPad, and we came up with an awfully long list. I think there's just as long a list here, though. I mean, since I kind of took the lead last week, I'll let you start with this one.
All right, so I feel like I want to start. Oh man, there's like so much choice in here.
Right.
I could start from something that we talked about last week that we mentioned. I want to mention it again. The backup situation on iPad,
sure.
On an iPad OS. I wish that it could learn from the Mac about the benefits of Time Machine and just in general the benefits of having a local backup system that is more similar to the Mac and that it doesn't just rely on iCloud. And I get it. Like, I get it why Apple wants to simplify backups on iOS. The fact that you don't have to think about it. The backup is not backing up an iOS or iPadOS device. It's not like backing up a Mac where you need to set it up. You need, to orchestrate a whole workflow for it. You just enable it in iCloud. It's a simple switch and it's done. But I wish that I had the freedom to, first of all, as I mentioned last week, sort of browse the contents of my backup without having to use a utility like iMazing on macOS.
Right.
I wish that it was more like Time Machine, where there was some kind of very lightweight version control built in, where I could go in and say, show me the backup from 2 days ago, because I accidentally deleted this file, or I accidentally made a change that I didn't want to make. And so I wish there was a way to not only back up your device, but also browse the backup. And something that a lot of people always ask us, club members and Mac Stories readers, a way to back up your device offline without an internet connection. Now, it's very possible that this will never happen because
right.
iOS and iPadOS were designed from the start with this iCloud integration in mind. But I won't lie, it would be super cool to have, like you plug in a USB-C drive, create a backup of your iPad that is encrypted, but also totally offline, that doesn't require fast upload times in your home connection, to upload hundreds of gigabytes of data to Apple's servers.
Right.
And especially for those times of year when I'm working on a really important project like my iOS review, I wish that I had that option of creating local backups. So more flexibility in the backup system of iPadOS, without necessarily having to complicate things. I'm not imagining a scenario where the iPad gets utilities like Super Duper or Carbon Copy Cloner from macOS.
Right.
But something a little more flexible would be nice.
Yeah, it would be nice. And I think with the fast SSDs that are available both on the device and as external drives, it would be awfully nice to be able to do a restore from an external drive. I think it would go a lot faster than doing an iCloud backup restore. So, I think there's a whole category of things to talk about here too that go to low-level integrations at the system level. And I'm thinking about things like, we've talked at various times about how audio is handled on iOS and the fact that you can't both be recording a Skype call and your local audio at the same time. And I think about those things on the one hand, and I also think about at the same time the fact that there's just one USB-C port on an iPad Pro, for instance. And I'd like to see a second port, but I feel like that second port is only going to be really taken advantage of in a meaningful way if some of these lower level OS type things are also addressed, so that you can have multiple peripherals attached to an iPad and use them simultaneously without any issues of the OS getting in the way.
Yeah, that would be super nice, and especially when it comes to my podcasting setup,
right?
Having more control, having better settings to define what goes where, without having to buy all kinds of additional accessories and cables, such as what I had to do to record podcasts the way that I like to do on iPad. That would be extra nice. And speaking of low-level stuff, obviously, we mentioned this many times before. It's worth repeating. I wish that the iPad could learn a bunch of things from macOS when it comes to external displays.
Right.
So right now, when you plug in an external display on your iPad, it doesn't work like on the Mac where you extend your display. You're just mirroring what's on your iPad to the external monitor. And yes, some apps can output full screen content, but that's a specific API and also a very old API that was originally designed for video games that some developers have sort of taken advantage of for their utilities and productivity apps. But what I'm thinking of is I actually want to extend the screen of my iPad. Like I can have multiple desktops on the Mac. I also want to have multiple home screens, for example. When I extend my home screen, when I connect the iPad to an external display. And now that we have a pointer, which means now that we can control apps and windows on iPad without actually touching the screen, I also would like to move a window from the iPad to the external monitor and to maybe resize it or maybe use drag and drop to the external monitor. Because again, we have a pointer, we have support for the Magic Keyboard, we have support for external mice and trackpads. I think it's time to have proper external display support to finally achieve the dream of a single device, a single slab of glass that can, be a tablet when you hold it in your hands, a sort of laptop-like device, but then when you dock it on your desk, it sort of becomes this workstation that can output proper, it can actually extend its display to the external monitor, and you can work that way with a virtual pointer.
Right. This feels like the perfect thing for the iPad Pro, right? Especially if the iPad Pro gets bigger. It would be really neat, I think, to have a 3-pane split view on the iPad itself, but also on that external display, because having a third app on screen at once would, I think, go a long way to making the iPad Pro, kind of remain the pro version. Whereas, we've got the iPad Air now, which comes awfully close to the Pro. I feel like there's new things that need to be added to the Pro to kind of keep it in that Pro category, and this would be one of them that I'd love to have.
Okay, software. Or is there anything else you want to mention about accessories and hardware?
No, I
John?
think that's it in terms of hardware.
Have we mentioned the second USB-C port that we would like to see?
Yes.
Okay. I'm just going through the list again. I thought we wouldn't have anything, or maybe not so much hardware related. I guess we do want to have some hardware changes to the iPad. But software is more fascinating to me. So I want to start with automation and specifically shortcuts. I think it's time for shortcuts to try and go beyond just having actions for apps or specific system features and be able to control the system itself.
Right.
And on iPad specifically, I think what I would like to see is proper integration between shortcuts and multitasking. What I would like to see is the ability to not only change the front, like if you have a split view, for example, in front of you, it would be nice if you could change that split view and rearrange apps with a shortcut.
Right.
That would be cool. To control split view, to control slide over without touching the screen just by running a shortcut. But I wanted to do more, and what I would like to see is the ability for shortcuts to sort of recreate spaces for you.
Yeah, exactly.
So things like open Twitter on the left and give it this, narrow layout, and then open IA Writer on the right, and then put these apps in slide over and put slide over on the left. Full control for multitasking on iPad, full integration with multitasking, the ability to open and close windows, the ability to create spaces, the ability to switch between spaces. All of this done in an automatic way. But also, beyond that, what would be super cool, which is actually possible on the Mac, to control those windows. And so to do things like, open Ulysses, select the text field, and paste this string of text.
Right.
Like stuff that you can do on the Mac with apps like Keyboard Maestro, for example. You can say, activate this window and then select the address bar in Safari, for example. I wonder if that's sort of not necessarily like UI scripting, which is an old concept, but something where you can actually control apps automatically via shortcuts. I wonder if that could be possible on iOS. And I wonder if that could be actually easier on iOS because of the constraints of the iOS UI. And, this also applies to iPadOS, obviously. Like we have things like auto layout, which means apps are most apps are pretty much structured a certain way. There's always a status bar. There's always a safe area inset. So it could be easier to control those apps, from a utility like Shortcuts. I would be perfectly happy just with multitasking integration. But if they were to go a step beyond and allow you to control apps without having to touch the screen, that would be super cool. In addition to this, I would also like to see better and actually real integration with keyboard shortcuts. I want to be able to create and assign global hotkeys for running shortcuts system-wide, just like I can on the Mac. I think it's counterintuitive that the easiest way to run a shortcut right now is to either add it to the home screen as a widget or search for it via command space in search and then select it and press enter. I think it would be so much easier on iPad if you could just assign a keyboard shortcut. And no matter where you are in the system, if you press that keyboard shortcut, the shortcut runs.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And, on the Mac, those global hotkeys can work with individual apps too. And, there can be collisions as a result of that. But I can see a system where iOS tracks what, the database of global hotkeys are. And if you are defining one that would collide with another, it would give you an alert and tell you to pick something different. That makes a lot of sense to me. I think your idea of shortcuts controlling multitasking is a great one because, we've talked before about wanting the ability to save spaces in some way in the system. And this is kind of I think a clever solution to that, where you don't have to actually necessarily change iOS's UI to accomplish it. You can just allow shortcuts to build them and tear them down. And as a result, you use a keyboard shortcut or you tap it on the screen, and all of a sudden it's rebuilt the way you want. Now, you'd have to have, as you said, a lot of control over exactly what apps, but not only what apps, what files. It'd be great to be able to open up a text editor and say, I want this particular document opened, one you've been working on, and that sort of thing. That could be really powerful.
Let me go through my list of other feature requests.
All right,
I have.
Go for it.
Also inspired from the Mac. On the Mac, you can do these things called cron jobs, which means you can, it's very much a nerd thing that you can run shell scripts and other types of commands on a schedule. Obviously, I'm not imagining something like that on iPad, but just make it easier for me to run a shortcut on a schedule without having to create a personal automation and create separate schedules for each occurrence of that shortcut. Just let me say, hey, run this shortcut every 20 minutes. Just make it easy for me to do that.
Right.
Also, taken from the Mac, better integration with files for shortcuts. Like, allow me to do things like batch file renaming for any file in any folder. Allow me to do things like, what are they called on the Mac? Folder actions, which are basically also what Hazel is built upon. Allow me to set up automations where, powered by shortcuts, obviously, where things happen when a file is downloaded into a specific folder, or if I rename a file, or if I add a tag. Bring tagging support to shortcuts, like deep integration between files and shortcuts, not just for actions, but also for automations and for reacting to changes in specific folders. What else? I want to be able to, just like on the Mac, little known fact, on macOS, you can run an automated workflow when a calendar event is due.
All right.
And I would love to have that as a trigger for automations on iOS and iPadOS. Give me the option to run a shortcut when a reminder is due or when a calendar event is due. Again, take what works on macOS and reimagine it for iOS and iPadOS and shortcuts. And I think mostly this is it. So controlling multitasking, some kind of control for apps, keyboard shortcuts, better integration with files, and more triggers for running shortcuts, including calendars and reminders.
Yeah, that's a good list. I think something that I would like to see come, and this is something we didn't mention last week, but we probably should have, which is more customization of the control center and allowing third parties into the control center, right? Now, this isn't something that the iPad needs to learn from the Mac because it's not possible on the Mac either. In fact, the control center on the Mac is far more limited than it is on the iPhone or iPad. And that's something I meant to mention last week and didn't, which is the control center on the Mac really needs to catch up with iOS. But I'd love to see third parties be able to use that as another extension point so that you could add in additional tiles in there and trigger various sorts of actions from those third-party apps. All right, Federico, here's something that's driven me crazy for a long time on iOS that needs to be dealt with, and that is the fact that iOS and iPadOS always turn images into JPEGs. It's just drives me insane. So if you take a screenshot and it's a PNG, and then you open a utility from the Photos extension, like a Notable, for instance, and save it back to your camera roll, it turns into a JPEG. Now, you may wonder why I care about that. Well, if I've got that image in an iOS frame using your shortcut, then the transparency goes away, and I've got a white background, which doesn't look so great when Mac Stories is in dark mode. And there's a bunch of different situations where this comes up for me from time to time, where I'm trying to do something with an image, and all of a sudden I'm stuck with a JPEG, and I include it in an article or something. I preview it before I publish, and I look at it and I think, oh, I forgot that it was going to turn into a JPEG, and I have to go back and start over and fix it. And I just feel like we need more control on iOS in terms of the types of files that are saved and exported when you're doing some sort of editing there.
Yeah, the way that they deal with images is infuriating.
Yeah, it really is.
Okay, John, I want to mention something that, once again, we covered on App Stories before, on Mac Stories before. It bears repeating because I really believe in this. I would like to see in the future of iOS and iPadOS, but even more so on iPadOS, because I see it more as a computer than my phone.
Mm-hmm.
Gatekeeper. I want to see Gatekeeper come to the iPad. So by Gatekeeper, I mean the idea of side-loading apps from sources that are not the App Store. So essentially, what you can do on the Mac by downloading apps from developers' websites and use them thanks to Gatekeeper, which is a whole suite of security and security technologies that allow you to run software from trusted sources, but still let Apple, use a kill switch if necessary to prevent those apps from working should, those apps contain malware or other kinds of problems. And I would love to see a secure and, official system for side-loading apps on my iPad without having to purchase them from the App Store, which would open up a whole new variety of apps that you can use on your iPad that are not optimized, let's say, for the App Store, because maybe they're using private APIs, because maybe they're doing something that Apple doesn't necessarily like. But just like we're able to install clipboard managers, UI customization tools, menu bar utilities, all kinds of third-party apps on our Macs, I think the iPad is mature enough to support a similar system. Imagine a world where you could have a proper clipboard manager on your iPad, where you could have utilities that extend shortcuts with additional actions that maybe wouldn't be approved on the App Store. Or imagine a scenario where things like Delta, the popular emulator by Riley Tested, or Dolphin for iOS, old video game console emulators could officially run on iPad without using something like AltStore. I just feel like there's so much untapped potential for literally opening the gates of iPadOS and allowing third-party software to run outside of the App Store while still maintaining that basic security level granted by Gatekeeper, managed by Apple. I don't know. I really want to see this happen. I think it would really revitalize the whole ecosystem. And obviously it would have consequences on the App Store. It would have consequences on developers. Obviously, we could see a new era of iPad software. We could see companies like Panic, for example, make apps that wouldn't be possible on the App Store because of the App Store's limitations. they could make those with Gatekeeper on iPad. So I don't know. I just feel like maybe it's not in Apple's best interest to do this, but I think the iPad as a platform at this point is mature enough to support that potential scenario.
Right. I agree. And I think it also would go a long way in terms of getting, I guess, addressing some of the governmental concerns about the
Very
tax,
good point.
right?
Yes.
Right. And the 30%, if you could sell an app outside the App Store, I mean, you could go on the App Store, get the benefits of the App Store, pay your 30%, or go off the App Store and pocket the entire price. All right. I want to kind of wrap up, I guess, Federico, by just mentioning a couple of more things related to files. And one is the fact that you can sort files by so many different criteria in the Finder that you can't on iOS, which also drives me a little crazy, especially one that I use literally every single day on my Mac, which is date added. Because date create, a lot of times I will download, say, some sort of file. Maybe it's a PDF that a developer sends me about their app, something like that. And maybe it was created a week or two before. And if I use date created, which is available on iOS, it might be buried down beneath a bunch of other things that I've downloaded more recently. But on the Mac, that's super easy to deal with because you just go over to the date added column and you sort by that. And I use that sorting more often than I do date created now because it just lets me find the stuff that I've been working on most recently. And I'd love to see that come to iOS along with a bunch of other sort criteria that could be added. And then finally, it's time to be able to upload music files to the music app from your iOS devices. This is something that's been available on the Mac since the very beginning. You should be able to upload MP3s, AACs, whatever they are, upload them to your iCloud music library and have them available to play without having to have a Mac involved. And it's just not possible right now.
Can you believe it that Apple released iTunes Match 10 years ago?
Oh, it's
it used
a
to be
long
called
time.
iTunes Match. Now it's called iCloud Music Library.
Right.
I used to pay for iTunes Match.
Same.
By the way. And it's been, I want to say it's been over 10 years, and you still cannot upload songs from your iPhone or iPad, even if you pay for Apple Music. That's wild.
There's a lot of weird legacy stuff with music. I mean, I was reminded of iTunes Match recently because I've been testing various Macs, and one of the limitations is I think you can only have 5 Macs associated with
yes.
right?
Yes.
And this one that I've got on loan from Apple is not authorized. So I can still play my streamed music, but if I have a playlist which has one of my owned songs in it that are in that iCloud music library, it'll give me an alert saying you can't play this, which I think is kind of funny in this day and age because I have no idea in those playlists which ones are streaming and which ones are owned, but every now and then it will trip over one of them and give me an alert. So I end up going to my phone and playing it from there. All right, Federico. Well, that's it for this week. I want to thank our sponsor again, and that is DevonThink. You can find me and Federico over at MacStories.net and Club Mac Stories. Federico is on Twitter and Instagram where he's at Vitici. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.